I want to start with something small, 35 pounds of rock. Not treasure, not equipment, not food. 35 pounds of grey stone dragged on a sledge across the Ross ice shelf by 5 men who were starving to death and who knew they were starving to death. They could have dropped it at any point. Every ounce on that sledge was an ounce they had to pull. They were behind schedule, short of fuel, and the temperature was falling faster than anyone had planned for. Men in that situation abandon everything that is not survival. They did not drop the rocks. They pulled them until they could not pull anything, and then they died in a tent 11 miles from a supply depot. And when a search party found the tent 8 months later, the rocks were still on the sledge. Hold on to that detail. 35 pounds. We are going to come back to what was in them. Most people know the Scott expedition as a story about failure. 5 men reached the South Pole in January 1912, found Amundsen's flag already there, and died on the way back. That is the version that gets told. Heroic, tragic, and essentially about a race that was lost. What that version leaves out is that the Terra Nova expedition was not primarily a race. It was a scientific program with a polar journey attached to it. It carried geologists, biologists, meteorologists, and physicists. It ran a research station for 2 years. It produced volumes of published findings. And the 35 pounds of rock on that sledge is the single most important thing the expedition brought back. More important than the flag, more important than the diaries, because those rocks contained something nobody expected to find at the bottom of the world. The rocks were collected on the Beardmore Glacier in February 1912 on the return journey at a place called Mount Buckley. The party stopped, behind schedule, exhausted, and spent most of a day geologizing. Scott's own diary records the decision. He knew what it was costing them. What they found in the exposed rock face were fossils, plant fossils. Leaf impressions clearly preserved of a species called Glossopteris. Glossopteris was a seed fern. It grew in dense forests. It required temperate conditions and liquid water and soil. And its fossils had already been found in South America, in Southern Africa, in India, and in Australia. The men who found it on the Beardmore Glacier understood immediately what it meant. The interior of Antarctica had once been forest, not tundra, not scrubland. Forest, warm enough, wet enough, and stable enough to support standing trees at a latitude where the sun does not rise for months at a time. They were carrying the proof of it when they died. This raises a simple question that has never been answered. If a continent that is now the coldest place on Earth was once warm enough to hold standing forest, what else was standing in it? I want to be honest about the scale of what that finding did, because it is easy to understate. The distribution of Glossopteris across 5 separate southern landmasses became one of the primary lines of evidence for continental drift. Alfred Wegener cited it directly. The idea that the continents had once been joined, that South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica had formed a single landmass, was ridiculed by the geological establishment for roughly 50 years after Wegener proposed it. It was not broadly accepted until the 1960s. Scott's men dragged the evidence 11 miles short of a food depot and died with it. And it took half a century for the discipline to catch up to what was on that sledge. The document exists. The follow-up does not. Here is where the story stops being settled. If Antarctica was forested, then Antarctica had an ecosystem. Forests do not exist alone. They exist with things living in them. And what has been recovered from the Antarctic fossil record since 1912 is, in the most literal sense, a fraction of a fraction. Roughly 98% of the continent is buried under ice, averaging nearly 2 kilometers thick. The fossil-bearing rock is accessible only where it is exposed, in the Transantarctic mountains, on a handful of coastal outcrops, in scattered nunataks pushing through the ice sheet. That is the entire sample. Every Antarctic fossil ever found comes from the 2% of the continent that happens not to be covered. And in that 2%, the finds have been extraordinary. Cryolophosaurus, a large theropod dinosaur described in 1994 from the Transantarctic mountains. Sauropod remains. Fossil forests with tree stumps still standing in growth position, roots in ancient soil, marine reptiles from the coastal deposits. All of it from 2%, selected not by where the fossils are, but by where the ice happens to be thin. And the Cryolophosaurus find is worth sitting with because of what it implies. It was a large predator, roughly 6 meters long, recovered at around 4,000 meters of altitude in the Transantarctic mountains, in rock roughly 190 million years old. A predator that size requires prey. It requires a food chain underneath it, several layers deep across a large territory, none of which has been found because the territory it hunted is under the ice. We have the top of a food web and almost nothing else from it. The word that appears in the literature is inaccessible. I want to stop on that because it sounds like a description of a place, and it is actually a description of a budget. Inaccessible does not mean impossible. Russian scientists spent 24 years drilling 3.5 kilometers through ice to reach Lake Vostok. It was done. It was expensive and slow, and it was done. Antarctic bedrock is inaccessible in the same way the deep ocean is inaccessible, which is to say it is reachable, and nobody has decided it is worth what it would cost. Inaccessible describes a decision in the language of geography. So what is under there? What if the 2% we can see is not representative? What if the coastal outcrops preserve coastal species and the interior held something else entirely? What if a continent that supported standing forests for tens of millions of years, in polar light conditions no other landmass experienced, produced animals adapted to months of darkness that have no analogue anywhere in the rest of the fossil record? What if the largest land animals of the southern hemisphere are sitting under 2 kilometers of ice, complete and undisturbed, in the 98% nobody has looked at? I do not know. Nobody does. Nobody went back to check. Now, this is where the counter-argument arrives, and I want to give it properly because it is strong. The strong version says the 2% is not a random sample, but it is not a useless one either. Paleontologists can and do reason about what a continent contained from partial exposure. It is what the discipline does everywhere, because no fossil record anywhere is complete. The Antarctic finds so far are broadly consistent with the southern hemisphere fauna found in Australia, South America, and southern Africa during the same periods, which is exactly what continental drift predicts. There is no particular reason to expect the interior to hold something categorically different from the margins. And more importantly, the ice is not a vault. Glacial ice moves, grinds, and destroys. 2 kilometers of moving ice over millions of years is not a preservation mechanism, it is a demolition mechanism. The expectation that intact, articulated skeletons are waiting under the sheet is probably wrong on basic geological grounds. I take that seriously. I think most of it is correct. But here is what it does not settle. Every one of those arguments is a prediction, a reasonable, well-founded, professionally made prediction about the contents of a place nobody has examined. And this is where those 35 pounds come back. Because in 1912, the prediction was that Antarctica had always been frozen. That was the reasonable position. That was what the discipline expected. And 5 men picked up a rock on a glacier, on a day they could not afford to spend, and the rock said forest. They were not looking for it. Nobody predicted it. It was simply there, in the 2%, waiting for someone to stop and look. That is the entire argument for looking at the other 98. I want to end somewhere other than a monster under the ice, because I do not think that is what this story is. What happened on the Beardmore Glacier in February 1912 is that 5 men who were dying made a decision about what mattered. They were behind schedule. They were short of food. They stopped for most of a day to chip rock out of a cliff face, and then they carried it. Scott's last diary entries do not mention the fossils. By that point, he was writing about his family and about the men beside him and about the weather that was killing them. The rocks were just on the sledge. Nobody was arguing about whether to keep them anymore. And when the search party opened that tent 8 months later, the specimens were still there. They did not know what they had. They knew it was forest, and they knew that was impossible. And they knew it needed to get back. They could not have known it would help settle the shape of the continents. Half a century of geologists would argue about it before the discipline agreed that 5 dead men on a sledge had been right. 98% of that continent has never been looked at. Not searched and found empty. Never looked at. The only reason we know Antarctica was ever a forest is that somebody stopped on the worst day of their life and picked up a rock. The absence is the record. If the things that were carried out of impossible places by people who did not survive the carrying are the kind of history you want more of, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.